epilepsy, and its mission to cure epilepsy is dear to my heart. My older sister, Ellen, developed epilepsy as an infant. She struggled for her life. We struggled as a family to control her seizures. And sadly, she passed away a few years ago. My mother was diagnosed with epilepsy just a few years ago for a different reason. So it's important to know that epilepsy can strike in at any time, and we need to learn more about it, talk more about it, and find solutions for it. We have representation from many congressional offices and federal agencies here today and online, and we thank you for your time, your partnership, and your interest in learning more. The recently launched Epilepsy Caucus co-chairs, epilepsy organizations, and epilepsy advocacy community have come together to host this briefing so that we can educate about the epilepsies and the funding priorities for the upcoming fiscal year. You'll hear directly from people with epilepsy, people who care for people with epilepsy, and an epilepsy specialist about the needs of the community and how more federal investment into the epilepsies can improve awareness, access to care, and ultimately health outcomes. A recent study reported that the total health care burden for people with epilepsy is at least $54 billion annually in our country. This is not a trivial condition. We'll also provide a brief seizure safety training because seizures can happen anywhere and at any time. And we want everyone to be prepared to safely support somebody who's having a seizure, just like we would if they were having. We are delighted to be joined by co-chairs of the first ever Congressional Epilepsy Caucus. It is so exciting to say that after so many years of hoping for this. Congressman Greg Murphy and Jim Costa launched the bipartisan Epilepsy Caucus to raise awareness, understanding about the epilepsies, as well as implementing meaningful legislation and advocate for funding for epilepsy research in Congress. Before we begin our program, however, somebody from the epilepsy community you may be aware of wanted to give a special thanks for coming today, and this is actor Greg Grundler. The video.
Well, there. I'm Greg Grundler, and I want to welcome you to today's congressional briefing on epilepsy. You can see television and film, show like listening, Alien, Long Hero, the movies, and Star Trek, and Star Wars. My greatest role as a father is to grieve part of our sons, including my oldest, Jake, who lives in epilepsy. It's 26-year journey with epilepsy has been heartbreaking, joyful, inspiring, and we've been through what I like to call the epilepsy car wash. Rolling. Jake's just like millions of other facing neurological disease and the balance from doctor to doctor during the early years. We faced many obstacles, but we persevered. Jake would never give up. We would never give up. No seizure could ever stop him. And today he is thriving, thank God. We're working hard to knock down those obstacles for others touched by epilepsy. But it is a struggle. It continues to be a struggle. We still have significant gaps in research funding. We need better coordination with doctors, patients, advocates, researchers to improve outcomes, patients, the earlier diagnosis when seizures first happen, and improve surveillance methods that better define the impact of epilepsy on different populations. And then there's the stigma, the stigma. We still have a very long way to go on battling stigma of seizures and epilepsy, and that's why it is time to talk. I co-founded and talked about a company many years ago to raise awareness in epilepsy, remove the stigma, help to make a real difference, which is what you can do today. I hope today you will learn from our experts, doctors, caregivers, advocates, and people living with epilepsy. And I hope that you will join our effort and do all that you can in Congress to pivot vital funds for pediatric onset epilepsy authority and inclusion of epilepsy in the CDC National Neurological Conditions Surveillance System, among other activities. I urge you to work with us to improve patient access to care, remove the stigma, and help more patients thrive. Like my son, really here then guess what? I encourage you to talk about it. Thank you so much. Enjoy the day and keep doing everything you're doing. We really do. Well,
Well, we thank Greg for that message. Really important points. We are delighted again to be joined by the co-chairs of the Congressional Caucus, Congressman Greg Murphy and Jim Costa. We're so thankful for your leadership and look forward to working with you to grow the caucus, advance funding and policy solutions that will improve the lives of people with epilepsy. Please join me in welcoming Congressman Dr. Greg Murphy to North Carolina's 3rd District, and then we'll hear, I hope he's able to arrive. Congressman Jim Costa of California's 21st District. Congressman.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you all for coming out. A couple of y'all have heard my stories before. I'm a surgeon by trade, so I do not treat patients with epilepsy. However, many of the patients that I treat have epilepsy. But my particular focus and pull to the caucus has been really a personal one. My son, who's now 28, developed epilepsy when he was 14. And it took us about 8 months to get his seizures under control. As many of you know, with epilepsy, it is a literally trial and error to be able to determine which drug works best for each patient. Some may work great, but they have bad side effects. And so you move along. And my son went through 5 medications, 5 different ones, until finally one has worked. And now it's worked for 14 years. He is a race engineer for Dale Jr. in NASCAR. So he gets to do neat things. I've been out with him on the track, and it's pretty neat. So he's been blessed to be able to now drive and do all those things, which were laid in question at that time. I will tell you, there's a new family. There's somebody else in my family now has epilepsy. My sister. My sister is 62, and she had a questionable seizure a couple of years ago. And I'm not sure quite of all the details, but this past summer, she had a seizure while driving in Raleigh and crashed into a wall and totaled her car, and some other things have happened since then. And so now she's been trying to get her seizures under control. So, it's not that it's a matter of time for these of us, but it is so common that things are happening. Going back to just the medications, I spoke about this the other day. You have to sometimes just throw them up on the wall in some certain conditions to see which ones fit. Blood pressure medicine, sometimes with insulin, some of these other things. But what we're always hoping for, and I spoke with a group who has ALS the other day, we're always hoping for being able to turn and look at the news the next day or pick up a paper and see the next cure, the next treatment. I'm not going to get political here, but I'm hoping that people will understand the IRA last year when it passed put a big damper on some of the research, because this is a small molecule, and normally it takes 10 molecules to be able to bring one to market. And I'm not pleading the case for pharmaceutical companies. But what the IRA did is it took, instead of 14 years for companies to recoup the losses for those other 9 medicines, down to 9. And so it's caused a lot of companies, 50 in fact, to draw back and say, well, we may not be proceeding with this medicine. And so sadly enough, we're at a point now where we were I talked about the fantastic achievements I've seen in my 30-year medical career, because new cures, with prostate cancer, 10 years ago, I would have to tell patients sometimes, hey, look, there's nothing else. Go get your affairs in order, enjoy your family some last days. And now I can tell them, look, you're going to see your grandkids live. You're probably going to see them graduate and get married. We want to be able to tell our folks with epilepsy, look, you're going to have a great future. We may be able to cure you. We may be able to give you medicines that are going to be lifelong, that have very few side effects. And so there is a balance between pharmaceutical companies' profits and then still being able to do that groundbreaking research that we want to happen and continue to happen, for which the United States has been on the vanguard, really for the world. And so hopefully I'm going to get Representative Costa to join me in trying to slide some of those restrictions back a little bit, just so research can continue in the way that it was being done before. So I encourage you all, thank you all for coming today. This is a very, very important topic and talk about it. It is a stigma, as Greg mentioned a few minutes ago, that we have to constantly keep fighting to try to break. So I thank you for all your work today and thank you for having me. Elders in the building.
So there's lots of seats up front if anybody wants to sit. I'd love to get a picture while we're waiting for the Conecker. Right now. Right. So looking for you. You're walking in. Well, I would love to know.
Thank you.
Good morning. Oh, come on. Good morning. Wonderful morning, and it's good to have all of you here and enjoying with my colleague, Dr. Murphy, who shares the profound passion for the desire to ensure that this caucus gets off to a good start for all the right reasons. Clearly, as we know, epilepsy is a health issue that has been with us forever. And each and every one of you showing passion in one way or another to ensure that we provide education about epilepsy, ensure that we provide support for medical research, and ensure that we do everything we possibly can to let America know that this was an opportunity for very talented, creative people to excel and to exceed far beyond what people understand because of the individual talents that they have. As some of you may know, I represent the wonderful people at the 21st Congressional District of California that involves Fresno and Tulare counties for people who know a bit of the geography in California. We're a big state, as you know, 40 million people, largest state in the country. And some of my colleagues are bemused and confused a bit about what goes on in California. I always say, well, you know, the California and the East Coast stretch from Boston in the north to Charleston in the south. They go, well, that's a bunch of states. Go, bingo. California could be 6 different states. But obviously, I'm very proud to be a member of that 52 person congressional delegation. And I'm also pleased to be a part of this briefing for epilepsy, this breakfast to really talk about the challenges that we face. We all have a story. As you all know, there's over almost 3.5 million Americans, including 470,000 children and teenagers living with active epilepsy in the United States. 1 in 1,000 will die of sudden unexpected death. Otherwise known as SUDEP, the mortality rate is almost twice the level for African Americans. Financial burdens clearly make it worse for those who are living with epilepsy to have access to the good care they deserve. It's critical, I think, for those who have epilepsy to have a voice in Congress, and that's what this is really all about. That's why I'm so excited to have this panel here. So excited to be a part of this founding effort with Congressman Murphy, because it's absolutely critical that you have a voice and that your concerns and your issues are heard and understood because they're critical, I think, a message that I would want to leave you with. So we're trying to bring members together and experts to implement meaningful legislation for funding epilepsy research in the United States Congress. That is the primary part of our agenda in this year's Congress. We're going to focus on working with you because you're one of the rubber meets the road, really, on breaking the stigma by giving those living with epilepsy much needed voice in Congress, in our nation's capital. So I'm very proud to be a founding member, a co-chair of this caucus. And let me just aside, some of you know the story, but we all come to understand issues of health through different paths. Usually it's because we know someone, or we have a family member, a person that is close to us that is diagnosed with epilepsy. In my case, I was thinking about it the other day. I came to Congress as an intern before I had any of this Arctic blonde you're looking at. I was 21 years old through my junior and senior year at Fresno State. And I was working in our Congressman's office, Congressman Vries. And his chief of staff was a person who was known in the valley, active in the Portuguese community, by the name of Tony Clow. And, Tony was, a role model for many in the Portuguese community. And so all of a sudden, I'm an intern in the office, and Tony would take the time and meet with the interns, and, try to educate how we can better understand how Congress works. But as a matter of fact, he said, one day we were having a conversation, I have epilepsy. I've never met a person who said they had epilepsy and knew very little about the nature of the illness. And he began to explain how he was diagnosed and how it impacted his life. He was going to school in Loyola, in Southern California. Some of you know where that institution is. And he, at the time, wanted to enter the priesthood. And as he likes to tell the story, at the time when he was diagnosed, he was in 20 or 21 years of age, the Catholic Church had a bar for those with epilepsy and other kinds of illnesses from entering the priesthood. And he went into depression. He felt that this was his calling. And he had some friends, he had some professors there who were mentoring him and said, look at Tony, there's other paths for you, and maybe you're not going to become a priest at this time. But you should, think about what other things you could do. And he did. And so, obviously, he had an opportunity to come to Washington, work in the Congressman's office, become the chief of staff, and then get elected on his own. And so he inspired me and share that story with you, for those you don't know that story. Because we all learn about epilepsy in different ways. And that's how I learned about it. And learned about what individuals challenge and struggle to deal with it as a young person. And how he overcame his own, insecurities and feelings as to whether or not he could lead a productive life. And so really that's a combination of the story I think that we all share in one way or another. And that's why I encourage those staff members that are here from different offices to encourage your member to join the caucus. That this is bipartisan. I think healthcare in America generally should not be a partisan issue. I mean, all Americans deserve access to good quality healthcare. And so for those of you who are here from different offices, go back and encourage your member to why this is a good idea, why they should get involved. And as I said in our last meeting, Congressman Murphy and I will do everything we can to reach out and to bring in more members. But you also can be very helpful. And so when you're walking the halls here, when you're reaching out to people from your own state, let them know that this would be something that they could be very helpful, that they should get involved and they should participate. Because we need to grow this caucus, and we will grow this caucus, but we can't do it by ourselves. We need your involvement. So I want to thank all of the partners, your efforts and collaboration, including the Epilepsy Action Network, the Epilepsy Foundation, the Cure Epilepsy, the Rare Epilepsy Network, and the Deep Connections organizations. All of these play a role, and we must work together to develop the synergy necessary to succeed. Your work is critical, it's important, and it does not go unnoticed. Trust me. So, let's continue to work together to improve healthy outcomes. And I want to thank all of you for attending this briefing. And Kit, where's in my office is those the healthcare portfolio and other important items that she deals with. And please don't hesitate if you can't reach me to reach out to Kit. And we've got work to do. It's that simple. But together we can make great progress. I'm excited about this caucus. I spoke to Tony about this a couple of weeks ago. We stay in regular contact. He continues to inspire me and mentor me. My gosh, 21 years of age, I was here in Washington. First time I was in our nation's capital, working in our congressman's office, wondering what the world would be hold for me in the future. And I think that I've had the wonderful opportunity and the privilege to represent people in California and to help people every day, and that's my passion. So let's work together to make it happen, okay? Thank you so very much. Keep up.
Thank you so much. Thank you for that encouragement to join this really important caucus. It is important, and it has been, as I mentioned, long in coming, and we're delighted. It was launched in February, and since then we actually have 13 members who have joined. And as the Congressman put it multiple times, we would love to have your members join. Here's the list of folks who have already joined. And Congressman has mentioned his staff member. There's also a staff member in Congressman Murphy's office. So please, we were going to put the information up on the slide. We have that available. Yep, here. You can reach out to these folks and put your offices listed as well. So want to move on to the main portion of our program, and that is to kick off our panel. To do that, I would like to introduce Dr. Archana Pasupuleti, who will provide first an overview of the epilepsies. Dr. Pasupuleti is a pediatric neurologist and epileptologist in Washington, D.C. She received her MD from George Washington University School of Medicine. She completed her pediatric residencies and pediatric neurology residency at Children's National Hospital here in D.C., and then did a fellowship in clinical epilepsy at UCSF Benhoff Children's Hospital in San Francisco. So I'd like to introduce you.
Thank you, Laura, for the warm introduction. I am honored to speak with all of you today and to share this space with people living with epilepsy, their families, advocates, and stakeholders in the room. I've dedicated my career to advocate for children's healthcare, and it's been a privilege to treat children with neurological disorders, and particularly epilepsy, and often rare epilepsy. This is why we're all here today. Epilepsy is a common neurological disorder that impacts the lives of millions of Americans and their families. 1 in 26 And I repeat that number, 1 in 26, because that's the number I want all of us to remember throughout this morning. If you haven't already been personally touched by epilepsy, chances are you will be. A friend, a neighbor, a classmate, a family member, or even yourself. Today is about giving a voice to those who could not be in the room with us, and how we can all make an impact to improve the lives of those living with epilepsy. So just like our heart has constant rhythmic electrical activity that causes it to beat, our brain is the same way. Neurons in the brain use electrical and chemical signals to communicate with each other. A seizure occurs when there's a disruption in this activity, and you have a sudden burst of abnormal signals in the cells. The surge of activity can cause involuntary movements, loss of awareness, or abnormal sensation. Epilepsy is a disorder of the brain that is characterized by recurrent seizures. Though people often use the words interchangeably, it's important to note that epilepsy and seizures are not the same thing. Not everyone who has seizures has epilepsy. And that distinction becomes really important as we talk about the epilepsy journey. Next slide, please. Epilepsy can actually be considered a spectrum disorder because of the different seizure types, its different causes, its ability to impact a person, and the severity of the disease, and often coexisting conditions. When we talk about epilepsy, we often talk about what type of seizure someone has, whether they're focal, meaning they start in one location in the brain, or they're generalized, where the electrical activity is disrupted all over. What causes they have, and whether we can put everything together to come up with a diagnosis and a syndrome. Because of this, we are starting to call the disorder the epilepsies, to reflect that it is not a static condition, and there is a tremendous amount of variation, even within an individual patient. We often say, once you've seen an individual with epilepsy, you've actually only seen one person with epilepsy. We continue to make tremendous progress towards understanding the underlying causes of epilepsy, from structural changes in the brain, such as injuries, strokes, or malformations of brain tissue at a cellular level, genetic and metabolic conditions that impact the way a brain develops, to infections. However, we are still have almost 50% of patients where we actually don't know the cause of epilepsy. And this is where research and funding can really make a difference to the population. The etiology or cause behind epilepsy can make a difference in how we manage treatment, the prognosis, and other comorbid conditions. Next slide, please. I put this slide up to show you that I actually think of epilepsy as a disease of the nerves. When many of us think about seizures, we may picture uncontrolled jerking of their arms or their legs, people who fall down, have loss of consciousness, maybe bite their tongue. But really, seizures can be more subtle. If you look at all the different areas where there's colors, you can sometimes have abnormal sensations, repetitive movements. Those who often stare or stop, have a pause in their action. Maybe they mix up their words or have confusion. And sometimes we can't see seizures at all. It really depends on where the abnormal electrical activity starts and how it spreads through the networks. We talk about networks because the networks we often have involved in epilepsy also cause comorbid conditions. In fact, epilepsy can be thought of not just as recurrent seizures, but as neurobiological, cognitive, and psychosocial consequences. The same networks in the brain that are disrupted during seizures are the same pathways in other conditions such as depression, anxiety, memory, executive functioning, And these conditions can often be more debilitating to a person's life than the seizures themselves. And to show the most common comorbidities often are depression, anxiety, and ADHD. Patients with epilepsy have a 5 to 6 times higher risk of death than individuals without epilepsy. They can have sudden, unexpected death in epilepsy, known as SUDEP. And while we don't know the cause of SUDEP, we do know some of the risk factors. It is seizures that are difficult to control. If you have seizures that occur at night, if you have seizures often associated with other comorbid conditions. And in addition to SUDEP, there are other mortalities for those living with epilepsy. It can be suicide, drowning, motor vehicle accidents, or even uncontrolled seizures. As we've heard earlier today, epilepsy impacts all aspects of an individual's and their caregiver's lives. It can be difficult to maintain a steady job. You can have higher healthcare resource utilization, including increased ER visits, hospital stays, and outpatient visits, medication, and treatment. Oftentimes, if you have seizures, you may not be able to drive. You may not be able to go to your medical appointments, which then complicates the epilepsy journey in terms of adherence to medication and seeking appropriate treatment. Next slide, please. We know that those living with epilepsy often have a lower socioeconomic status. The impact of epilepsy cannot be understated. Oftentimes, they have difficulty pursuing education, or they have difficulty with employment or maintaining employment. Their overall health care is often impacted, and it can impact their household's income. Next slide, please. And we can't speak about epilepsy without viewing it in the context of social determinants of health. These factors really determine access to care, and specifically access to epilepsy centers, adherence to treatment, getting a timely diagnosis, and getting on the right treatment, and even being able to maintain their treatment regimen. Those with lower socioeconomic status, it often correlates with the severity of their epilepsy. So if you think about it, if you're having seizures and you're in the hospital, or you have frequent days in which you have to take off from work, you will suffer the economic consequences of that. As a clinician, the most difficult conversations I've had with my patients and their families often involve a multitude of these factors, because treatment for epilepsy does not exist in a vacuum. And so as we think today about funding priorities, we also have to think about them in the context of these determinants of health. Next slide, please. While we may not be able to cure epilepsy just yet, we continue to advance our therapeutics. In the last several years, we've seen a rapid development of new targeted therapies, specifically for seizure types, as well as certain genetic syndromes, leading to dramatic improvement in seizure control. We have diet therapies. We have devices that can often detect implantable devices that not only recognize seizures as they're occurring, but actually stop them, and hopefully retrain the brain's networks to prevent epilepsy. We have brain surgeries that can identify the source of seizures. And once we do, we can actually remove the tissue that's causing their seizures. But we also have significant health disparities in this population. And this is where all of you are critical allies in this fight. Not everyone has the same access to care or can afford the treatments that dramatically improve their lives. Next slide, please. But neuroscience and epilepsy are evolving at rapid speed. The future is really with precision medicine. We continue to identify genes that cause epilepsy and associated conditions. This can allow for earlier diagnosis, targeted therapies, along with creating comprehensive treatment models for families. And this really impacts the life and quality of a person living with epilepsy. Recently, we've had recommendations and new guidelines that talk about starting genetic testing earlier in the epilepsy diagnosis. And a few weeks ago, scientists have just announced the development of the pan-genome, a DNA model that reflects the current diversity of our population. This new development is no doubt going to bring new insights into the causes of epilepsy, ultimately targeted treatment, and what we all hope for up here. So I'd like to thank you all for being here today, your time in listening to all of the panelists, as well as engaging with the epilepsy community. Our next speaker, Bree Baton, she is a former Teen Speak Up participant and an epilepsy advocate from Maryland.
Hi everyone, I'm Bree and I'm a rising senior at GW right around the corner. Thank you for all of your words. So I was diagnosed with epilepsy in 5th grade after having an absent seizure at my friend's house. And after being diagnosed, the rest of 5th grade was a blur. I was in and out of doctor's offices and hospitals and labs, getting EEGs and MRIs and blood drawn and random prescriptions, which is a lot to handle. When the biggest concern I've had in my life so far was the one time my clip-on behavior chart went down from green to yellow. I went from having no idea what a seizure was to learning that I have a lifelong diagnosis in just a matter of 2 days. Throughout the next few years of my life, my epilepsy was a secret that only my family, my doctors, and I shared. It was lonely and burdening, holding on to this with no peers to support me. But the way that I saw it, it would be even more lonely if I told my friends, because they would see me differently than they did before. And knowing that I had something no one else did was one thing, but having other people know about that was even more terrifying at an age where all you want is to fit in. This lasted until junior year of high school, when I had a seizure at an overnight retreat. Unlike the rest of the seizures I'd had in my life, this one was in front of people who didn't know I had epilepsy. To be precise, a room with over 100 of my peers, who I saw at school every day. Although this was embarrassing and upsetting at the time, this event changed my life forever. Instead of making fun of me, my classmates were supporting me, which had been my biggest fear for the past 7 years. After this, things at school were different, but not the way I thought they would be when I was first diagnosed. I decided I no longer wanted to hide myself, that my epilepsy is a part of me, but it will never be something that defines me. I spent so much time being afraid of myself and my diagnosis that I never stopped to think about the amount of people in this world who are just like me. I realized that I didn't need to feel alone with my epilepsy or in sharing my story. I became involved with the Epilepsy Foundation's Teen Speak Up, and I volunteered at a camp for children and teens with epilepsy. I met another girl at my school with epilepsy, and we presented in front of the entire student body, along with holding a school-wide fundraiser. My epilepsy has helped me grow and has taught me so much about both life and myself. However, I can't deny that epilepsy has not exactly been my best friend. My teenage years were spent with an unexplainable dark cloud above my head at all times. I've had to skip events and classes solely because I couldn't sleep at night. I'm grateful for the things that I've learned, the people I've met, the experiences that I've had, and I wouldn't change any of those for the world. But it doesn't dismiss the fact that we need to make more people aware of and educated about epilepsy. The fact that these things are not done more openly is what leads to the stigma surrounding it. Epilepsy is real, it is common, it's not fun, but it's not something to be ashamed of. And I really hope that in the near future, we can make people understand that so that less kids grow up in shame and fear the way that I did. Thank you.
Thank you for sharing your story. So I'd like to introduce Evelyn Gibbs. Come on up. And she has a short story.
Good morning, everybody. I'd like to first thank you all for being here. I'd like to share a story as it pertains to my son, Jonathan. Jonathan passed away in January 2020 at the age of 21 years old due to SUDEP, sudden and unexpected death in epilepsy. And today I'd like to share a little bit about his life and why the epilepsy initiatives and support of the various bills are so important. John was born a twin, full term, 39 weeks, 5 days, so full term. He met all of his developmental milestones on time. He crawled on time, he walked, he spoke on time. When he was about 15 months of age, he had his first seizure. So of course, we rushed him to the emergency room, and because he was so young, they felt, or they told us at that time, it's probably a febrile seizure, which is common in young children. He had another seizure. Again, we went back to the emergency room. Again, we were told that it was probably febrile seizures and he would probably outgrow it. When Jonathan was 5 years old, he had another series of cluster seizures. We took him again to the hospital, and at this time, an EEG was performed and he was diagnosed officially with epilepsy. He was placed upon a traditional epilepsy medication, Keppra, and he seemed to do well for a while. You may have a seizure every now and then, but for the most part, his seizures were well controlled with the Keppra. When he was 17 years old, things started to change. And then he started to have what we consider to be breakthrough seizures, cluster seizures. So he would literally have seizures 3, 4, 5 times a day, every day. We worked with the doctors at Walter Reed, and then subsequently with the doctors and epileptologists at NIH, National Institutes of Health, trying to identify some type of treatment that would work for Jonathan. He received a device, vagus nerve stimulator, underwent surgery for that, and that's designed to, stimulate the vagus nerve in his brain in order to preclude the seizures from occurring. That worked for a little bit, and then they stopped working. Subsequently, again, we worked with the doctors at Walter Reed and NIH, and we tried to identify a series of medications that we could put him on. Unfortunately, Jonathan was tremendously allergic to a lot of the epilepsy medications, and even particularly some of the traditional epilepsy medications. As a result, he developed what's called Stevens-Johnson syndrome, which is a extremely rare and severe reaction to medication. He was hospitalized for 2 months, and he spent at least a month in the ICU, and actually had to be airlifted from Walter Reed over to Washington Hospital Center in Washington, D.C. When he was released, finally, in order to try to offer some type of solution for the seizures, or some way to at least control the seizures, he was put on a series of medication, benzoids, which serve to highly depress your nervous system. So he was on benzoids. He was taking about 10 to 12 pills 3 times a day. And again, these medications made him very slow to speech a little bit. In fact, I had one of his teachers come and ask me if he was smoking weed, to which I had to explain to him about the medications and the side effects of the different medications. Ultimately, in order to graduate on time, in high school on time, Jonathan had to pass the standards of learning. And he worked very, very hard. Finally, last day of the SOL, he was able to pass it. and graduate and walk across the stage on time with his twin brother, Christopher. That was probably one of the biggest achievements and the proudest moments of Jonathan's life. He then went on to go to Northern Virginia, Nova Community College with the hopes that once his seizure activity was better controlled, he would be able to go to a four-year college along with his brother. Sadly, on the morning of January 3rd, I spoke to my son, Jonathan, and made him breakfast, as I always did. And when I came home later on that evening, I found him deceased in his bed. With that, I will say this. One of the things that Jonathan said to me, and I think that this was extremely profound, he came running into my room one evening, and I'm thinking, what's going on? And he said, Mom, I wish I had cancer instead of epilepsy. And anybody who knows anybody with cancer or is hurt or has experienced cancer knows that that's not something you would want. And I asked Jonathan, I said, Jonathan, why would you say that? And he said to me, Mom, people understand cancer. They don't understand epilepsy. And that always stuck to me, sticks to me to this day. And that, for that reason, and others, I think it's so very, very important to support initiatives that will lead to the correct accounting for people who are impacted by epilepsy. And providing research and funds to support further research into epilepsy and potential treatment. So again, with that, I thank all of you for coming out today. And I really hope that you are able to inspire your representatives to support these initiatives. Thank you.
Very difficult story. And so many people have lost loved ones to SUDEP, and it's a difficult journey. We need to talk about SUDEP more as well. So thank you so much. I would love to next introduce Conecker, the chairperson of the family. Thank you so much for being here today, and thank you to Evelyn for sharing her story. So this is my daughter, Vega. We'll talk about her brother, Elliot. So I'm mom to Ellie, who is 10, and Vega, who is 7. And we want to tell you a little bit of a different story about epilepsy. And you'll see on the screen, this is a video we had shot and some pictures that you'll see so you can understand who Elliot is and his life as we talk. So Elliot was born in 2012 and was perfect and beautiful, but very soon we started noticing that he was having movements that were very strange. And unfortunately, it took months of trying to convince pediatrician that something was actually going on. And so we lost many months of time and treatment for Elliot. He was never developing either. He wasn't making eye contact. He wasn't lifting his head. He wasn't cooing or speaking. So things went on like this, and our journey at about 2.5 months of finding out that Elliot had epilepsy when he got that old, and then actually starting to search for a diagnosis. And without a diagnosis, that meant that we were doing spinal taps, EEGs, MRIs, tissue samples, anything you can think of, blood draws to try to find what was going on. We spent months of Elliot's life in the hospital, birthdays, Christmases, Passovers, all of the holidays that you wish you were spending together around the table. We were around a hospital bed. And more times than I'd like to admit, we were rushed to the hospital in an ambulance in the middle of the night, and in the code room a number of times where we almost lost Elliot because we couldn't stop the seizures. So I tell you this to understand that epilepsy is a very diverse disorder, right? You've heard from people today about Jonathan's experience. You've heard Free. There are many thousands and thousands of children like Elliot who are living with what we call the rare epilepsies. And for these children, many of them require 24-hour daycare. Every single thing that has to happen in his life has to be done by myself, his father. Vega helps me in nursing care, using the bathroom, eating, putting him into standards so that he can develop some bone strength. Our life centers around Elliot. We go out only if we can. If Elliot isn't well, everything changes. Everything turns on a dime. And that has severely impacted Vega's life as well. How she goes to school, how she engages in the world, and the isolation that we live in. We lost most of our friends. Most people don't understand this life that we live and how hard it is and what it takes. And I think people are scared by it. It's very challenging. So my husband quit his job when Elliot was about 1 year old because we recognized that we needed to have intensive care for our child. And still to this day, he has to live on the night schedule so that somebody can be watching him 24 hours a day overnight. So as you heard Congressman Costa say, or actually it was working, I think, about throwing spaghetti on the wall. That's basically what it is. Every treatment decision for my son has been a guess. And we've been confronted by doctors saying, this treatment could help or it could kill him. What do you want to do? And that's really the challenge right now, is that we are not learning from our children, right? There's no system right now for us to gather intelligence and learn from the experiences, the challenges of every single child so that we can do better with our kids and do better for those who are yet to come. So I can tell you that as a parent, it is incredibly depressing and defeating to recognize that there's very little you can do to help your child. Many families like mine live in fear of losing our children, of regressions for our children. We have despair that there are not treatments that currently work for our children. So that means that we need to do better. We need to do better to understand what epilepsy is. We need to do better and really start to understand what we need to do to shift the curve here. And to do that, we need your help. So I'm really grateful to all of you for taking this time to be here today. And I hope that you will go back and share our stories. You can always reach out to any of us. You know how to find Liz, you know how to find Laura, and we can come and speak if you need us to come and share some impact stories. So thank you for stepping up and helping. Do you want to say something real quick? Yeah. Okay. You can ask them. Go ahead. Listen.
When I joined my new school, every day I would eat my lunch outside the cafeteria, even when it was raining, just so I could stop myself from getting sick. And I didn't know when my class was gonna come out, and I would be punished if I started playing too early.
Mm-hmm. And you want to say something about the dinner? Thank you, Brandy. These are the challenges that we face. Many of our families face these challenges, and we don't talk about it. We need to talk about it. We need to expose how difficult life can be. So I want to thank all of our speakers. You can see how epilepsy impacts their lives in different ways, perhaps, but significantly. We need so much to move the needle, as we said, to improve the lives of those who are impacted by epilepsy, and that includes family members, that includes the siblings. They don't sit outside and need to protect the sibling that they love. So again, thank you for sharing this powerful story and your help. So we are seeking solutions in many policy areas, but given the limited amount of time we have today, we want to focus on areas of the federal budget that are instrumental in helping people with epilepsies. I also want to point out the number of organizations that are behind these efforts. The epilepsy community is supporting these efforts with one voice, and that is an amazing feat. for so many different organizations. You'll see that there are 36 organizations that have signed on to a letter that describes the appropriations asks for FY 2024. Next slide. We want to walk through these asks, and I want to do this. I know we're a little bit behind, and so here is a list of the asks that we have, but we really want to walk through them and describe their importance. So we're going to start with programs under the Labor, Health, and Human Services, Education, and Related Bills. So let's go to the next slide. I believe. We're first going to talk about the Pediatric Epilepsies Consortium. You heard about the challenges that families face in the pediatric space. Why do we need this type of organization, Gabi? What's important about it?
As I alluded to, we are not learning from our children who are struggling. We do not currently have a system that is tracking what medications work, what medications don't, what kind of syndromes people are getting, and the kind of impacts that has on them. So if we, what we're proposing here is 10 million to start this pediatric onset epilepsies consortium so that we can bring together clinicians and researchers and families to start documenting what's actually happening. And then we can finally start to use data for decision-making, as opposed to every time someone gets diagnosed, we guess what to do. Our kids deserve better, and it's something that we can do. We've seen it with the pediatric cancer, the COGS, and it's doable. We just are asking for us to get the process started at this point, and we will be behind you all the way to help guide you from this side. But this is a really huge step in finally being able to have kids like Jonathan be able to say, we know what to do for you. We know how to help you. And based on real world data that we have today, we need to mobilize that. And we can do that. We need to start somewhere, and that's the idea behind the Pediatric Onset Epilepsies Consortium. Again, other disease areas have been able to enable this and make a difference for the patient population. There are existing programs under the LHHS that are important to the epilepsy community. Pre, as a young person with epilepsy, why is the CDC epilepsy program important to you?
I think that it's important because it opens up conversations, educating people and spreading awareness about epilepsy by educating those essential people in our community, such as educators and people who are constantly around those with epilepsy, whether they know it or not. So it is just very important. I remember when I had a seizure in front of my school nurse had no idea what to do. I woke up and she was sitting on top of me, which is not proper seizure first aid. So we need to pass this program. We need $13 billion to pass this program in order to make sure that cases like that don't happen.
Thank you, Craig. The National Neurological Conditions Surveillance System at the CDC was authorized through the 21st Centuries Act in 2016. It's since been managing demonstration project focused on multiple sclerosis and Parkinson's disease, but the intention has always been to include other neurological disorders, such as the epilepsies. Gabi, why is it vital that the system is expanded to include the epilepsies?
As things stand right now, we do not have a true sense of the impact of epilepsy. All these numbers that we have are based on estimates, their best guesses. We need to do better. And this, for the surveillance system that was set up, is perfectly poised to be able to step up and start saying, what do we actually know about epilepsy? Who has epilepsy? Where? How are they doing? And so to finally be able to say that we can have a true sense of the scope and the burden of this disorder is going to be huge for us to be able to then be able to say, what do we do about it? How do we move forward and find better answers?
Thank you. Finally, there's a registry that's largely funded by the CDC's Safe Motherhood and Infant Health Program and run in collaboration with the National Institutes of Neurological Disorders and Stroke. That has the ability to track SUDEP-related deaths of people up to the age of 20. Evelyn, can you speak to why funding for this registry is so important?
Yes, currently, we do not have an understanding or an accurate count of the number of individuals who have actually succumbed due to SUDEP. This is so critical and so important because once we have an accurate accounting, then that attention will be there and the research and the funding will be able to be allocated. I'll use an example. If we remember back to the pandemic, when it only impacted a couple of people in a couple of different locations, not a lot of research was done. But once the numbers grew, the attention came, the funding came, and that allowed for the research and the development of medications which could treat, preclude, and vaccinations that could treat and preclude this. And so again, it's so critical to have that funding available to treat the epilepsy and the epilepsy-related consequences and complications.
Thank you, Evelyn. I just want to thank those agencies that are behind this, these teams that are behind moving this effort forward. The CDC works hard to understand prevalence of disease states, and we need to encourage them to support the epilepsies additionally as well. And again, the NIH is doing a phenomenal job driving basic research and translational research, but we need some more focused attention on the epilepsies. So we want to thank them for their enthusiasm for these programs, as we talked to them about these already. There are also a few very important programs in the VA and defense bills. The Military Construction VA Appropriations Bill funds the VA Centers of Excellence for Epilepsy. Veterans can acquire epilepsy through a variety of means, including combat and non-combat events. For example, traumatic brain injury can lead to epilepsy. Given this connection, in 2008, Congress passed a law directing the VA to establish epilepsy care centers within the VA health system. Now there's a network of 19 sites that provides comprehensive evaluation and care for veterans with seizure disorders. The ask in FY 2024 is $23.5 million, which was included in the president's budget. I want to point out that this is for 19 sites. And this is actually an increase. You can see the deep need for our veterans in care in these centers. And more is needed. The Defense Appropriations Bill funds 3 vital programs within the congressionally directed medical research programs. These programs are the Epilepsy Research Program, the Traumatic Brain Injury and Psychological Health Research Program, and the Tuberous Sclerosis Complex Program. These programs fund research to better understand various contributors to epilepsy, such as traumatic brain injury, and even diseases such as tuberous sclerosis complex, which is a rare disorder that is hallmarked by non-malignant tumors that occur in the brain and that can cause seizures. So through research to improve our understanding, we can improve patient care and outcomes ultimately. And our ask is at least $12 million for the Epilepsy Research Program, $175 million for the TBI and Psychological Health Research Program, which actually covers a vast array of research needs, not just TBI, and at least $10 million for the TSC Research Program. So that is a summary of the asks that we have. I'd like to invite Dr. Pasupuleti back up to provide some seizure training.
So as we heard, 1 in 10 individuals may suffer a seizure in their lifetime. And I'm someone who has seen and treated thousands of seizures, and it's hard watching them. It's hard each time you see one. But it's important to understand that even if you're a bystander, there are things that you can do to keep a person safe who's having a seizure. So it's important to just remember 3 words: stay, safe, side. Really, if you notice someone who's starting to have a seizure, stay with the person during the seizure and until they return to their baseline. Keep the person safe. So if they're in a chair or they're near objects, get them to the ground, get them away from anything that they may hurt themselves while they're having a seizure. And also turn the person on their side. One of the big concerns that people often have is, will they choke during a seizure? If you turn them on their side, If they have any saliva, if they have any vomit or any other secretions, they'll actually spit it out rather than swallow. And it's important to note, because I do know it's out there in the community, well, can their tongue go to the back of their throat? Can they suffocate? Can they not breathe? If turning them on their side prevents all of this. And it doesn't matter which side, just get them to their side. You can often place something soft, like a sweatshirt or something under their head to prevent them, if their head is shaking, to prevent it from hitting the ground and injuring themselves further. But we don't recommend surrounding them with pillows or surrounding them with other objects, just something small underneath their head if needed. Things not to do when someone's having a seizure. Oftentimes, you want to hold the person down because it's terrifying to see their extremity shaking. It's hard to watch them shake, but really nothing you do is going to prevent their brain from stopping a seizure. So we say, don't restrain them. You're actually more likely to injure them if you do. Don't put anything in their mouth, and don't try to sweep away anything from their mouth if they're having a seizure. It's actually more of a risk to you that you can be injured, and oftentimes many people with seizures are having a seizure, their jaws are clenched. If you try to pry their mouth open, you actually risk injuring them even further. And do not give any food, water, or medications until they're awake and able to swallow safely. Oftentimes, in schools especially, we will have a seizure action plan. It actually lists out what to do for the individual patient or person who's having a seizure. It usually identifies the type of seizure, if you have to give medications, and at what point to give medications, or when to call emergency response system. Slide, please. These are the instances in which you would actually call EMS if the seizure is prolonged. So if the seizure occurs and is lasting several minutes, often more than 5 minutes, it actually requires medication to stop a seizure. So it's important to call EMS. If it's a first-time seizure or a person who has an unknown epilepsy history, that's an appropriate time. If they have difficulty breathing, or they're not recovering to their baseline, that's another time in order to call. And of course, if there's ever any concern, we do encourage calling EMS. But many individuals with epilepsy will tell you that they often don't need emergency services. Their families and the individuals will often say they can recover on their own. Next slide, please. This is just very brief, but we do encourage everybody in the room to visit the Epilepsy Foundation as well as the Epilepsy Alliance of America. There's actually free seizure training and certification that can be obtained. It's actually very important, given how common seizures are, to be able to know what to do in these emergencies. And I'm happy to answer any questions afterwards as well.
It is so important that we all learn about seizures. We know what to do if somebody's having a attack. We know what to do if somebody's choking. We don't know what to do if somebody's having a seizure. It's made clear it happens frequently, and you need to know how to protect people so that they can recover and go on with their lives. As difficult as that life can be sometimes. So I know we've got a few minutes for questions and answers. If there are any in the room, I know we have a few online, but they're a little difficult to manage logistically. So we'll get back to you for those questions. Other questions in the room?
That one. If you guys could say one thing to members of Congress to make a difference, what would that one piece of advice be to Congress that they do?
Archana, could you re-say the question? So the panelists were asked if there's one thing we could say to Congress
or give a piece of advice, what would that be? I would say the advice that I give all of my patients and their families is that as you're living with epilepsy, we still want you to be in the driver's seat and epilepsy in the passenger seat. Epilepsy is really just one component of your life, and we don't want it controlling your life. So what we can do through our policies and our funding and our education and awareness is to make it so individuals living with epilepsy are actually in control, and epilepsy is just a side story.
I would say start paying attention, start looking, start asking, because if you do, every single person in this room and every single member of Congress knows at least one person living with epilepsy. If it's 1 in 26, you know several people who experience epilepsy, and educate yourself, start learning, be curious. Epilepsy is diverse and can be very severe, as you saw, but it also is manageable for some people. So the more you learn, I think the deeper you'll understand the need is for us to find more answers, get through the research, and start truly funding epilepsy in line with the prevalence and incidence that it is in this country.
I would also agree with that. Education, educate yourself. Education is key. As mentioned, epilepsy is very diverse. So there are individuals who can take one medication and their seizures are very well controlled. And then you have other individuals, like my son was, we weren't able to determine what was causing the seizures. We weren't able to determine a remedy in order to treat the seizures or stop the seizures for a prolonged period of time. So again, you know, it's a very diverse and complex ailment. And so therefore, I do believe that education is good.
Sorry. Going along with that, I would just kind of say, listen, listen to the people around you, the people who are struggling, like they're as, I don't remember which one, but one of the senators was talking about how he went to an ALS group and they were talking about that and here's for that, but those conversations aren't really here for epilepsy. So listen to the people in your communities, what they need, what their struggles are, and help them.
Another question. I think one of the things we've learned we've been meeting with many offices over the last couple of months. We meet, the staffers and ask, do you know anybody with epilepsy? And so many times people have said yes, but we don't really talk about it very often. So again, I encourage you to even talk to your colleagues and learn what they know about the epilepsies. Any other questions or comments? Well, I want to thank you all for coming today. It is such a delight to be able to be here in this, first opportunity to come together under the leadership of the Epilepsy Caucus. And I want to thank the Congressmen for their interest and their willingness to drive that forward. We encourage all of your offices to join on, to learn more, to continue to advocate for more research funding and policies that help people with epilepsy. Again, you can find more information on the sheets on your chairs. We ask you to take those with you. And again, thank you.